The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Buckingham Palace as 23-year-old James Mitchell took his position outside the ornate gates. His red uniform was perfectly pressed, the brass buttons gleaming like mirrors, and his iconic bearskin hat sat precisely at regulation height. To the hundreds of tourists already gathering with their cameras and smartphones, he was just another stoic figure in the famous Queen's Guard, a living statue meant for photographs and entertainment. James stood motionless, his rifle held at the present arms position, his eyes fixed straight ahead at an invisible point beyond the growing crowd. His face showed no emotion, no recognition of the world around him. This was exactly what the tourists expected, a silent, unmoving decoration that represented centuries of British military tradition. What they couldn't see beneath that perfectly maintained exterior was a young man whose hands had learned to stop trembling only recently. They couldn't know that the steady rhythm of his breathing was something he had to consciously control, a technique taught to him by military psychologists during months of rehabilitation. The tourists saw pageantry and tradition. James felt the weight of survival. A group of teenagers approached first, phones already recording. "Look at this guy," one of them laughed, stepping closer than the designated boundary. "He's like a robot. Bet he can't even blink." They began making exaggerated gestures in front of James's face, trying to provoke a reaction. When none came, they grew bolder. "Maybe he's broken," another suggested, pretending to examine James like a malfunctioning machine. "Should we report this to customer service?" Their friends erupted in laughter, encouraging more elaborate performances designed to crack the guards' composure. James had been through the rigorous training that prepared Queen's Guards for exactly this situation. Tourists testing boundaries was nothing new. What was new for James was the way certain sounds, the sudden snap of a camera, the sharp crack of laughter, could transport him instantly to a place thousands of miles away where sounds meant survival or death. The crowd grew larger as word spread through social media about the particularly unresponsive guard. A middle-aged man with an expensive camera pushed through the group, positioning himself for the perfect shot. "My wife's going to love this," he announced to no one in particular. "She collects photos of these guard guys from all over the world. Says they're all the same, mindless tin soldiers." Behind James, the palace continued its daily operations, unaware of the growing spectacle at the gates. Inside those walls, security personnel monitored dozens of screens showing every angle of the palace grounds. They were trained to watch for genuine threats, not tourist enthusiasm, so the gathering crowd registered as nothing more than typical morning activity. A young woman with bright pink hair stepped forward next, emboldened by the lack of response to previous attempts. "I bet I can make him smile," she declared, beginning an impromptu dance routine inches from James's position. Her movements were deliberately silly, designed to be irresistible to anyone with a sense of humor. The crowd cheered her on, phones capturing every moment of what they saw as harmless fun. James's training kicked in automatically. He had memorized every regulation about appropriate response to public interaction. He knew exactly when he was permitted to speak, when he could move, and under what circumstances he could break his pose. The tourists' antics, while disrespectful, didn't cross any of those carefully defined lines. But beneath the surface, another kind of training was also at work. The hypervigilance that had kept him alive in Afghanistan meant that James was acutely aware of every person in the crowd, every sudden movement, every potential threat. His apparent stillness masked a state of constant tactical assessment that most people could never maintain for more than a few minutes. "He's probably thinking about his girlfriend," suggested a woman holding a toddler who was pointing excitedly at James's uniform. "Or maybe what he's having for lunch. I bet they get fish and chips in that fancy palace." The casual speculation about his inner life struck James as almost funny, if he had been in a position to appreciate irony. The truth was that James's mind was rarely quiet enough for such simple thoughts. Even during peaceful moments like this, part of his consciousness remained alert for the subtle signs that had once meant the difference between returning to base safely or not returning at all. The way someone held their hands, the particular angle of approach that might indicate hostile intent, the sound pattern that could signal incoming danger. A security guard from a nearby building noticed the growing crowd and walked over to assess the situation. He was used to tourist gatherings around the Queen's Guard, but this one seemed particularly enthusiastic. "All right, folks," he called out in a friendly but authoritative voice. Let's give the gentleman some space to do his job, shall we? Some of the crowd dispersed reluctantly, but the core group of entertainers remained, convinced they were on the verge of achieving something unprecedented, making a Queen's Guard break character. They had no way of knowing that James had already broken, in ways they couldn't imagine, and had spent months learning how to rebuild himself into someone who could stand here today. The morning wore on, and James remained at his post, a figure of apparent serenity amid the chaos of modern tourism. His commitment to duty was absolute, but it had been forged in fires that none of these laughing, joking visitors could comprehend. Every minute he stood there was a victory over trauma that wanted to drag him back to darker places. As the sun climbed higher and the crowd eventually thinned, James continued his vigil, carrying secrets that would have transformed mockery into respect, laughter into silence, and curiosity into gratitude. But those secrets remained locked behind his professional exterior, hidden beneath the red uniform and the unwavering dedication to serving something greater than himself. The tourists would move on to other attractions, taking their photos and their assumptions with them. James would remain, guardian of more than just a palace, protector of more than just tradition, and survivor of more than they could ever know. The afternoon shift brought new faces to the palace gates, but the pattern remained frustratingly familiar to James Mitchell. Different tourists, same assumptions, same casual disregard for the human being beneath the ceremonial uniform. As he maintained his rigid position, his mind drifted despite his best efforts to stay present, pulled back to memories that therapy had taught him to acknowledge rather than fight. 3 years earlier, Lance Corporal James Mitchell had been a different person entirely. Stationed at Forward Operating Base Shawkat in Afghanistan's Helmand Province, he had known a world where survival depended on split-second decisions and unwavering trust in the soldiers beside him. The desert heat was crushing, the danger constant, and every patrol outside the wire carried the possibility of not returning. His unit, the 2nd Battalion Princess of Wales's Royal Regiment, had been deployed for what was supposed to be a routine peacekeeping mission. The briefings had emphasized infrastructure protection and community engagement. The reality on the ground proved far more complicated than any training exercise had prepared them for. James remembered the weight of full combat gear, so different from the ceremonial uniform he now wore. Body armor, ammunition, communications equipment, medical supplies, everything needed to keep himself and his squad alive in a hostile environment. The irony wasn't lost on him that tourists now complained about how heavy his ceremonial rifle looked, never imagining he had once carried 3 times that weight while running for his life. The heat in Afghanistan had been unlike anything he had experienced growing up in the English countryside. It wasn't just the temperature, but the way it seemed to drain hope itself from the air. James had learned to function in that environment, to maintain focus and discipline when every instinct screamed for relief from the relentless sun and the ever-present threat of attack. Back then, his squad had operated as a single organism. Tommy Harrison from Manchester, who could diffuse tension with a joke even during the worst moments. Sarah Chen from Edinburgh, whose medical training had saved more lives than anyone could count. Marcus Williams from Cardiff, who seemed to have a supernatural ability to spot danger before anyone else. They had become family in the way that only shared danger could create. The mission that changed everything had started like dozens of others. Intelligence reports suggested that insurgents were using an abandoned school building as a weapons cache. James's squad was tasked with a simple reconnaissance operation: observe, report, avoid engagement unless absolutely necessary. It should have been routine. They had approached the target building in the pre-dawn darkness, moving with the careful coordination that months of training and experience had made second nature. James was point man that morning, his job to scout ahead and signal any potential threats to the team following behind. The responsibility was enormous, but he had performed the role dozens of times before. The school building appeared deserted from the outside. Local intelligence suggested it had been empty for months, damaged by previous fighting and abandoned by the community. James's thermal imaging showed no heat signatures, no signs of recent activity. Every protocol suggested the building was clear for closer inspection. What the intelligence reports hadn't mentioned was that the local insurgent cell had learned to mask their heat signatures using techniques borrowed from more sophisticated terrorist organizations. They had been waiting in that building for days, knowing that eventually coalition forces would investigate their deliberately planted intelligence leads. James had been the first through the doorway when the ambush was triggered. The explosion of gunfire in the confined space was deafening, disorienting, and absolutely lethal. In the first 30 seconds, everything he thought he knew about himself and his capabilities was put to the ultimate test. The firefight lasted 4 hours. 4 hours of sustained combat in 120-degree heat with limited ammunition and no possibility of retreat. James found himself calling on reserves of courage and determination he hadn't known he possessed. Every decision carried life-or-death consequences, not just for himself, but for the 3 soldiers whose lives depended on his ability to think clearly under unimaginable pressure. Tommy had been hit first, a sniper's bullet finding the gap between his body armor and helmet. Sarah had crawled through enemy fire to reach him, working frantically to stabilize his wounds while bullets splintered the concrete around them. Marcus had taken position at a window, his rifle providing the covering fire that kept them all alive minute by minute. James had found himself in the impossible position of squad leader by default, the senior NCO having been caught in the initial barrage. At 20 years old, he was making tactical decisions that would determine whether his friends lived or died. The weight of that responsibility was crushing. But there was no time to be crushed. He coordinated their defensive positions, managed their ammunition supplies, and maintained radio contact with base, even as the building around them was systematically destroyed by enemy fire. Every few minutes brought new crises that demanded immediate solutions. Sarah needed medical supplies. Marcus was running low on ammunition. Tommy was losing consciousness despite Sarah's efforts. The rescue operation, when it finally came, was a masterpiece of military coordination involving air support, ground assault teams, and medical evacuation units. But those 4 hours had stretched into an eternity for the 4 young soldiers trapped in that school building. By the time friendly forces reached their position, James had aged years in a single day. Tommy survived, though he would never walk normally again. Sarah received a commendation for her medical work under fire. Marcus was promoted and transferred to a training position back in England. And James was quietly recommended for psychiatric evaluation, though the official reports described his performance as exemplary. The trauma wasn't immediate. For weeks after the incident, James had continued his duties normally, seemingly unaffected by what the military psychologists called acute stress reaction. He completed his deployment, received his honors, and returned to England with plans to pursue a career in the regular army. It was only months later, safe in the familiar surroundings of home, that the delayed reaction hit him with full force. Sudden sounds triggered panic attacks. Crowds felt threatening. Sleep brought nightmares that seemed more real than waking life. The young man who had shown such courage under fire found himself unable to leave his apartment for days at a time. The path from that broken state to his current position outside Buckingham Palace had been long and difficult. Military mental health services had provided professional support, but the real healing had come through patient work with therapists who understood combat trauma. Learning to function again had required rebuilding his sense of self from the ground up. Standing guard duty had been recommended as a form of therapy itself. The structured environment, the clear expectations, the sense of purpose and service, all of it helped provide the stability that James needed to continue his recovery. What looked like simple ceremonial duty was actually sophisticated rehabilitation disguised as tradition. The tourists continuing to gather around him had no way of knowing that his stillness was hard-won, that his composure was a daily victory over chaos, that his silence protected secrets too heavy for casual conversation. They saw performance where there was actually profound human achievement, mistook strength for emptiness, and confused duty with decoration. As the afternoon sun reached its peak, James remained at his post, carrying the weight of experience that had shaped him into someone capable of protecting not just buildings, but the very ideals that buildings like palaces were meant to represent. His service here was no less real than his service in Afghanistan. It was simply a different kind of battlefield. The late afternoon brought a different energy to the palace gates. School groups were arriving for educational tours, their young voices carrying across the courtyard with an enthusiasm that reminded James Mitchell of simpler times. Among them was a group from St. Bassador's, Margaret's Academy, their teachers struggling to maintain order as 30 excited 12-year-olds encountered the famous Queen's Guard for the first time. "Remember what we discussed in class," the teacher called out. her voice competing with the chatter of her students. "These are real soldiers doing an important job. They're not here for our entertainment." Her words carried the weight of someone who understood military service, though James couldn't know that her brother had served 2 tours in Iraq. Most of the children listened respectfully, content to observe from an appropriate distance and whisper questions to their teacher. But one boy, perhaps 13 years old with sandy hair and an expression of barely contained mischief, had different ideas about appropriate behavior around the Queen's Guard. "Watch this," he announced to his classmates, stepping forward with the confidence that only comes from never having faced real consequences for poor choices. "I bet I can make him flinch." The boy began with small gestures, waving his hands near James's face, making sudden movements designed to trigger an involuntary response. James had dealt with hundreds of similar attempts during his months of guard duty. His training had prepared him for every conceivable form of tourist interaction, from the merely curious to the deliberately provocative. But something about this particular boy's approach struck him differently. Perhaps it was the age. The boy was roughly the same age as Ahmed, a local Afghan child who had befriended James's unit during their deployment. Ahmed had been curious about the foreign soldiers, eager to practice his English and share stories about his village. The friendship had been one of the few bright spots during those difficult months. The boy's persistence escalated quickly when his initial attempts failed to provoke a reaction. He began making loud noises, jumping suddenly into James's peripheral vision and eventually progressing to more direct physical challenges. "He's probably deaf," the boy declared to his audience of classmates. "Or maybe they remove their brains when they put on the uniform." His teacher noticed the disruption and began moving toward the group, but the boy was determined to achieve his goal before adult intervention could stop him. In a moment of spectacular poor judgment, he reached out and knocked James's bearskin hat slightly askew, disturbing the perfect alignment that regulations demanded. The reaction was immediate and stunning. James's hand moved with lightning speed to straighten his hat, the motion so quick and precise that several children gasped audibly. But more than that, something in James's eyes changed. A flash of intensity that transformed his face from ceremonial mask to something far more serious. "Step back immediately," James commanded, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. The words were delivered with such controlled power that not only the boy but his entire class took several involuntary steps backward. The boy, suddenly aware that he had crossed a line he hadn't known existed, mumbled an apology and retreated to the safety of his classmates. But the moment had created something unexpected, genuine curiosity rather than casual entertainment. The children were looking at James with new eyes, seeing past the uniform to the person underneath. "Are you really a soldier?" asked a girl with serious dark eyes and a notebook clutched in her hands. Her question was respectful, genuinely interested rather than mocking. "I mean, not just someone who dresses up like one?" James was not permitted to engage in casual conversation while on duty, but the direct question about his service fell into a gray area that allowed for brief, factual responses. "Yes," he replied simply, his voice carrying quiet authority. "I served with the Princess of Wales's Royal Regiment in Afghanistan before accepting this assignment." The information changed the entire dynamic of the encounter. The children who had been treating him as a curiosity now looked at him with something approaching awe. SAPSAM.COMCAMNBL. Their teacher moved closer, her expression shifting from concern about disruption to genuine respect. "Afghanistan," repeated an older boy who had remained silent during the earlier antics. "My cousin Danny was there with the Marines. He said it was really dangerous." The boy's tone held none of the mockery that had characterized his classmates' earlier approach. James nodded slightly, acknowledging the comment without elaborating. He had learned that most people, especially children, had little context for understanding what military service in a combat zone actually entailed. They knew it was dangerous in the abstract, but the reality of daily life under constant threat was beyond their experience. One of the quieter girls raised her hand as if she were still in class. "Is that why you can stand so still for so long, because you learned special soldier skills?" Her question revealed a level of thoughtfulness that suggested she was beginning to understand that his apparent stillness might represent something more significant than mere discipline. "Training helps," James replied carefully. "But it's also about serving something bigger than yourself. Every soldier learns to put duty before personal comfort. His words were simple enough for the children to understand while carrying deeper meanings that their teacher clearly appreciated. The sandy-haired boy who had started the disruption looked genuinely ashamed now. "I'm sorry I messed with your hat," he said quietly. "I didn't know you were a real soldier who had been in a real war." His apology carried the weight of someone who was beginning to understand the difference between game and reality. "Apology accepted," James replied with a slight nod. "But remember that uniforms represent real service by real people. Every person wearing one has earned the right to be treated with respect." His voice carried no anger, only the patient instruction of someone accustomed to teaching important lessons. The teacher seized the educational moment. "Class, this is what we've been studying about military service and sacrifice. The Queen's Guard aren't just for show. They're active duty soldiers who have served our country in some of the most dangerous places in the world." Her words connected their classroom lessons to the living example standing before them. A small girl with pigtails approached cautiously. "Were you scared?" she asked with the directness that only children possess. "When you were in the war, I mean. Were you scared but you did your job anyway?" Her question cut to the heart of what courage actually means. James considered his response carefully. These children deserved honesty, but also age-appropriate honesty. "Yes," he said finally. "Being scared is normal. Being brave doesn't mean not being afraid. It means doing what needs to be done even when you are afraid." Every soldier learns that lesson. The admission created a moment of profound silence among the children. They were processing the idea that heroes feel fear just like everyone else, that bravery is a choice rather than an absence of normal human emotion. It was a more sophisticated understanding than many adults possessed. "Can we tell our friends that we met a real hero?" asked the girl with the notebook, her question innocent but profound. The word hero hung in the air between them, carrying weight that James still struggled to accept. "You met a soldier who did his job," James corrected gently. "Heroes are usually people who don't think of themselves that way. They just do what needs to be done when it needs to be done." His deflection was characteristic of military culture, where individual recognition was often less important than collective mission success. The school group's time at the palace was ending, but the encounter had transformed what should have been a routine educational visit into something much more meaningful. As they prepared to leave, several children offered respectful waves or quiet expressions of gratitude that carried genuine understanding. The teacher lingered for a moment longer. "Thank you," she said simply. "You've given them something to think about that they couldn't learn from any textbook." Her appreciation was professional but heartfelt, recognizing the gift of authentic interaction with living history. As the children departed, James returned to his silent vigil, but something had changed. The encounter had reminded him that his service, both past and present, had meaning beyond his personal struggle with trauma and recovery. He was part of something larger, something worth protecting, something that connected him to the best aspirations of the society he served. The afternoon sun continued its descent, casting longer shadows across the palace courtyard. But for James, the light seemed somehow brighter, illuminated by the reminder that even ceremonial duty could serve educational and inspirational purposes that extended far beyond tourism and tradition. The evening shift brought cooler temperatures but intensified tourist activity as people sought the perfect photograph during golden hour. James Mitchell had been on duty for nearly 6 hours, and the cumulative effect of constant vigilance was beginning to show, in subtle ways that only someone trained to recognize combat stress would notice. His breathing was slightly more controlled than necessary, his grip on his rifle marginally tighter, his jaw set with the particular tension that comes from suppressing emotional responses. Among the evening crowd was a group of university students from Australia, loud and energetic after what was clearly a day of enthusiastic sightseeing and equally enthusiastic drinking. They approached the Queen's Guard station with the particular confidence that comes from being young, far from home, and convinced that normal social rules didn't apply to vacation behavior. "This is it, mate," announced their apparent leader, a tall young man with sun-bleached hair and an expensive camera. "The famous robot soldiers. I told you guys they were worth seeing." He began setting up elaborate poses with his friends, using James as an unwitting backdrop for increasingly ridiculous photographs. What started as typical tourist behavior quickly escalated into something more problematic. The group had clearly been drinking for hours, and their inhibitions had disappeared along with their respect for boundaries. They began treating James not just as a photo opportunity, but as a prop for their entertainment. "I wonder what happens if we really try to mess with him," suggested one of the girls, emboldened by alcohol and the encouragement of her friends. She began dancing provocatively close to James, making exaggerated gestures designed to be impossible to ignore. When that failed to produce a reaction, she became more aggressive. The situation deteriorated rapidly as the group fed off each other's energy and escalating dares. They began making physical contact, touching James's uniform, trying to position his rifle for better photos, even attempting to remove his ceremonial sword from its sheath. Each violation of protocol was met with laughter and encouragement from the group. James's training held, but beneath his professional exterior, something else was happening. The physical contact, the aggressive behavior, the sense of being surrounded by hostile forces, all of it was triggering responses that had nothing to do with tourist management and everything to do with survival instincts forged in combat. His mind began the dissociation that trauma therapists had warned him about. Part of him remained present, maintaining the disciplined stillness that his role required. But another part was being pulled back to that school building in Afghanistan, surrounded by enemies who wanted to kill him and his squad. The laughter of the tourists began to sound like the shouting of insurgents. Their grabbing hands felt like the chaos of close combat. "Hey, I think there's something wrong with him," observed one of the quieter members of the group. She had noticed the subtle changes in James's posture, the way his breathing had become more rapid despite his apparent calm. But her concerns were drowned out by the continued antics of her more aggressive friends. The breaking point came when the tall leader of the group decided to remove James's bearskin hat entirely. "Come on, robot," he taunted, reaching up toward the ceremonial headpiece. "Let's see what's underneath all that fake soldier gear. I bet you're just some actor they hired to stand here and look important." The moment the tourist's hands made contact with his hat, James's carefully maintained control shattered. 3 years of combat experience and 18 months of recovery work collided with alcohol-fueled disrespect and the accumulated stress of hours of provocation. "Get your hands off me," James roared, his voice carrying the full authority of someone accustomed to command in life-or-death situations. The sound was so unexpected and powerful that tourists 50 yards away turned to see what was happening. The Australian student stumbled backward, suddenly aware that he had crossed a line into dangerous territory. But James wasn't finished. Months of suppressed frustration at being treated as entertainment rather than as a human being performing serious duty erupted in a torrent of controlled fury. "I am a serving soldier in Her Majesty's Armed Forces," James continued, his voice carrying across the courtyard with crystal clarity. "I have served my country in combat, lost friends to enemy fire, and earned the right to perform my duties without harassment from ignorant tourists who think military service is a joke." The entire area fell silent. Hundreds of people who had been chatting, laughing, and taking photos stopped what they were doing to listen. This was clearly not part of the normal tourist experience, and the intensity in James's voice commanded attention from everyone within earshot. "You think this uniform is a costume?" James demanded, his eyes fixed on the Australian student with laser-like intensity. "You think standing guard is a game? You have no idea what real soldiers do, what real service costs, what real sacrifice means. This isn't Disneyland, and I'm not here for your entertainment." Security personnel were already moving toward the situation, their training recognizing that something significant was happening that required immediate attention. But they moved carefully, aware that James was armed and clearly in an altered state that could quickly become dangerous. The Australian student tried to stammer an apology, but James cut him off. 3 months ago, I was holding my dying friend in my arms while enemy bullets destroyed the building around us. 2 months ago, I was in therapy learning how to function again after watching good soldiers die for their country. 1 month ago, I was deemed fit to serve in this position because standing guard requires the same discipline and courage as any other military duty. The crowd had grown larger as word spread through social media that something extraordinary was happening at the palace gates. But now the mood was very different from the morning's casual mockery. James's words had transformed the atmosphere from entertainment to something approaching reverence. "You want to know what's under this uniform?" James continued, his voice now controlled but still carrying tremendous intensity. "Scars, nightmares, pride in service, loyalty to comrades. Commitment to duty that doesn't end just because tourists think it's funny to harass soldiers doing their jobs." A middle-aged man in the crowd began clapping slowly. Others joined him until the applause filled the courtyard. The Australian students looked around in confusion, suddenly aware that public opinion had shifted dramatically against them. What they had thought was harmless fun was being recognized as something far different. Palace security reached James's position, but their approach was respectful rather than confrontational. These were career military personnel who recognized both the legitimacy of James's response and the need to de-escalate the situation before it attracted even more attention. "Lance Corporal Mitchell," said the senior security officer quietly, using James's proper rank and name to establish connection and authority. "You've made your point clearly and professionally. Let's step back and reset, shall we?" The use of his name and rank helped ground James in the present moment. The dissociative episode was ending, and he was becoming aware of the crowd, the cameras, and the fact that his outburst had created exactly the kind of public spectacle that military discipline was designed to prevent. "Yes, sir," James replied, his training reasserting itself over the emotional response. He straightened his uniform, adjusted his hat to proper position, and began the mental process of returning to his ceremonial role. But something fundamental had changed, both for him and for the hundreds of people who had witnessed his moment of raw honesty. The Australian students departed quickly and quietly, their enthusiasm for tourist antics thoroughly dampened by the encounter with actual consequences for their actions. But many others in the crowd remained, viewing James with new understanding and respect. The incident would be reviewed, documented, and discussed in military mental health circles as an example of how trauma responses could manifest even in controlled environments. But it would also be remembered by everyone who witnessed it as a moment when ceremony gave way to truth, when entertainment collided with reality, and when one soldier's pain became a powerful reminder of what military service actually means. The days following James Mitchell's confrontation with the tourists brought unexpected changes to his routine and his perspective on his role as a Queen's Guard. Word of the incident had spread far beyond the palace gates, carried across social media platforms and news outlets that recognized the story's deeper significance beyond typical tourist guard interactions. The military's response had been swift but understanding. James was temporarily reassigned to administrative duties while his commanding officers conducted a thorough review of the incident. Rather than viewing his outburst as a failure of discipline, they recognized it as a symptom of the broader challenges facing combat veterans transitioning to peacetime service. Colonel Patricia Hartwell, the officer responsible for Queen's Guard assignments, had seen similar incidents before. Her own experience included 2 deployments to Iraq and extensive work with military mental health services. When she met with James in her office 3 days after the incident, her approach was professional but compassionate. "Lance Corporal Mitchell," she began, reviewing the file that contained both his combat service record and the incident reports from the palace. "Your service record in Afghanistan is exemplary. Your performance as Queen's Guard has been consistently professional until this week. Tell me what happened from your perspective." James had spent those 3 days replaying the incident, working with military counselors to understand what had triggered such an intense response after months of successful duty. "Ma'am, I allowed personal stress to affect my professional performance," he replied, using the formal language that military culture demanded for such discussions. "That's the official version," Colonel Hartwell observed. "Now tell me what really happened. Not as a soldier filing a report, but as a human being who reached his breaking point and reacted accordingly. The invitation to speak honestly rather than officially was unexpected but welcome." James had been carrying the weight of the incident alone, second-guessing every aspect of his response and wondering whether his military career was effectively over. "The tourists weren't just being disrespectful, ma'am," James began, finding words for feelings he had struggled to articulate even to himself. "They were treating military service like entertainment, making jokes about soldiers being robots or actors. It felt like they were mocking everything that uniform represents, including the friends who died wearing it. Colonel Hartwell nodded, recognizing the deeper issues that James was describing. Military service, especially combat service, creates a bond between the individual and the institution that civilians often don't understand. When that bond feels threatened or ridiculed, the response can be quite intense. What James didn't know was that his incident had already generated significant discussion within military leadership about the challenges facing ceremonial guards who were also combat veterans. The assumption that guard duty was somehow easier or less demanding than other military roles was being seriously questioned. "There's something else you should know," Colonel Hartwell continued. "The public response to your words has been overwhelmingly supportive. The video footage has been viewed millions of times, and the majority of comments express gratitude for your service and criticism of tourist behavior that treats soldiers as entertainment." The revelation surprised James, who had assumed that his loss of composure would be viewed as unprofessional and embarrassing. Instead, it seemed that many people had been waiting for someone to articulate the difference between ceremonial duty and performance art, between military service and tourist attraction. "We've also received several formal complaints about tourist harassment of guards," the colonel added. "Your incident highlighted a problem that has been developing for some time. Palace security is implementing new protocols to better protect guards from inappropriate behavior." The changes were already visible when James returned to duty the following week. Clear barriers had been established to prevent tourists from approaching within arm's reach of guard positions. Signs in multiple languages explained that guards were active-duty military personnel performing serious security functions. Security staff had been instructed to intervene more quickly when tourists crossed appropriate boundaries. But the most significant change was in the tourists themselves. James noticed immediately that people approached his position with different energy than before. There was more respect, more genuine curiosity, and less of the carnival atmosphere that had characterized previous interactions. A young father with 2 children approached on James's first day back, clearly wanting to say something but uncertain about appropriate protocol. Finally, he stepped forward with his children in tow. "Excuse me," the father said respectfully. "I wanted to thank you for your service, both overseas and here. My kids saw the video of what you said, and it helped them understand what soldiers really do." The man's words were simple but heartfelt, representing a level of understanding that James had rarely experienced from civilians. His children, a boy and girl around 8 years old, looked at James with expressions of genuine admiration rather than the casual entertainment seeking that had characterized so many previous encounters. "Are you the soldier who was really brave?" the little girl asked seriously. "My daddy says you helped protect people in a war." "All soldiers help protect people," James replied, grateful for the opportunity to redirect attention from his individual story to the broader concept of military service. "That's what we're trained to do, whether it's overseas or here at home." The interaction was brief but meaningful, establishing a tone that would characterize many of James's subsequent encounters with visitors. People approached him with questions rather than pranks, respect rather than mockery, genuine interest rather than casual entertainment. An elderly veteran stopped by later that afternoon, his own military bearing evident despite his civilian clothes. "Royal Navy, 1968–85. The man introduced himself quietly. "Wanted you to know that a lot of us old soldiers are proud of what you said." It needed saying. These encounters reminded James why he had chosen to continue his military service after returning from Afghanistan. The transition from combat to ceremonial duty wasn't a step down or a form of retreat from real military responsibility. It was a different expression of the same commitment to service that had motivated him to volunteer for deployment in the first place. Dr. Carabia, Sarah Martinez, the military psychologist who had been working with James since his return from Afghanistan, helped him process the incident and its aftermath during their regular sessions. "What you experienced wasn't a failure of your recovery process," she explained. "It was actually evidence that your recovery is progressing. You were able to articulate your feelings clearly and assertively rather than retreating into isolation or destructive behavior." The perspective helped James understand that his confrontation with the tourists, while professionally problematic, had also been personally necessary. Months of suppressed frustration at being treated as entertainment rather than as a serving soldier had needed an outlet, and finding his voice had been an important step forward in his ongoing healing process. 6 months later, James remained at his post outside Buckingham Palace, but his understanding of his role had evolved significantly. He no longer saw ceremonial duty as separate from or inferior to combat service. Instead, he recognized it as a different form of the same fundamental commitment to protecting something larger than himself. The tourists still came, still took photos, still sometimes tested boundaries, but the atmosphere had changed permanently. James's moment of raw honesty had created a new understanding of what the Queen's Guard represented. Not entertainment, not tradition for its own sake, but the visible expression of military dedication and sacrifice. On quiet mornings, as he took his position and prepared for another day of service, James sometimes thought about his squad mates from Afghanistan. Tommy was learning to walk again with prosthetic assistance. Sarah had returned to medical school to specialize in trauma surgery. Marcus was training new recruits at a base in Scotland. They had all found different ways to continue serving, different expressions of the commitment that had brought them together in that school building where they had learned what they were truly capable of. James's service at the palace gates was his own continuation of that same story, protecting different things but with the same dedication. The red uniform he wore carried the weight of centuries of British military tradition, but it also carried the specific stories of the people who had earned the right to wear it. James had learned that honor and ceremony weren't separate from real military service. They were its highest expression, visible reminders of invisible commitments that connected present duty to past sacrifice and future responsibility. Standing guard would always be, for him, both remembrance and vigilance, both tribute to those who had served before and protection for those who would serve after. The tourists, who now approached him with respect rather than mockery, were witnessing something real. Not performance, but dedication made visible. Service transformed into symbol without losing its substance. In the end, James had found his own way to continue fighting for something worth defending, not with weapons but with presence, not through violence but through unwavering commitment to the ideals that military service was meant to protect. His story had become part of the larger story that every uniform represents: individual courage in service of collective values, personal sacrifice for public good, human dedication transcending human limitation.